Hey Winston, how's it going?
Doing pretty good. How are you?
Doing all right.
Just ready for the weekend.
Are you?
Yeah, it's been a long week.
Well, I've got your grades done for your first exam, so your week's about to get longer.
Oof, not what I was hoping to hear.
Not what I was hoping to deliver. Um, anyway, we'll talk about that later. At the end of class, we'll have a little discussion. Hey Mary,
Hi.
how's everything going?
Pretty good.
What's wrong?
I pulled my calf muscle this morning, so I'm kind of in pain.
Oh no. How bad is it?
It's not that bad. Just I felt it pop, so he thought it was like a pretty high level pull, but it's whatever.
What were you doing?
We had conditioning this morning for basketball, so I was
Gotcha.
just like planted to turn and it just popped. So
You know, basketball is tough on the legs, especially because the floor is so grippy.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
those kinds of injuries are pretty common, I think.
Yep.
Hey Marcus,
Hey, how you doing?
doing all right. Where are you at in your picture that is your my video is off photo?
No, that is in Everglades, Florida, with the PAR program.
Okay.
I went this past winter.
Okay. On the outward bound thing?
Yes, outward bound. Yes.
Okay. All right. Not everybody's here, but it is 9 o'clock, 9:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. I have your exams graded. I'll talk to you some about your exams at the end of class today. But right now, what I want to talk about is Jared Diamond's chapter. So hopefully you guys have all gotten the opportunity to read that. It's been up for a little while. So in Jared Diamond's book chapter, I shared only one of the chapters with you. It's an interesting book if you're ever looking for something to read that's kind of sort of sciencey, but also kind of human history sort of based. I like the book quite a lot. But in this particular book chapter, he's talking about what I like to think of, and I think that if I recall correctly, Diamond kind of refers to it in terms similar to this. What's the natural endowment of organisms that different regions of the world possess? And what I mean by that is, what are the kinds of plants and animals that occurred in different places that had potential to be food sources for human beings? And of those, which ones of them and how many of them were actually readily available and easily domesticable? And so Diamond argues, so at the beginning of the book, because I don't think any of you have read this book, have you? Has anybody read Guns, Germs, and Steel? Okay. So at the beginning of the book, Jared Diamond shares this story about when he was in New Guinea. He had a guide that he used year after year after year, a guy named Yali, if I'm recalling correctly. And they were out in the field collecting one day, and Yali asked Jared Diamond the question, why do why do white people have so much cargo? And what he meant by cargo was, why do we have so much stuff? And in the process of kind of thinking about this question, that's what kind of got Jared Diamond down this path. So the first section of the book is Yali's question. And the answer that he came up with is that white people have so much cargo because we developed technology. And then when he steps back a step from that, he's like, well, why do we have technology? Well, we have technology because we have a division of labor. Why do we have a division of labor? Well, because we had city-states. Well, where did city-states come from? City-states came from, you know, dense aggregations of people who then had to get along together in small cramped spaces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he traced all of this back to ecological and evolutionary processes that led to the rise of some groups coming to power over time and other groups not coming to power. And he contrasted this with kind of the way history books were written when he was young, and he's now old. But when you would go back to, for example, the 1940s and 50s, and you were taught history, you were taught that the reason that the British came to prominence and the United States came to prominence was because of, you know, natural abilities, better than everybody else, you know, hard work, perseverance, et cetera, et cetera. And Diamond wants to challenge that idea to basically say, well, anybody put in the same place that the people who ultimately became Western Europeans, anybody that you put in that environment would have come to rule the world. So Guns, Germs, and Steel is his take on why did one group of peoples come to rule the world in the 20th century, whereas other peoples in the world did not. And he goes all the way back to his ecological and evolutionary training. And so he starts out looking at food, actually, which is why this book comes into this class. So he looks at where you find the major crops that we currently use. Where did those crops occur originally? And for other areas of the world, why did those areas not develop agriculture? And so his model for how societies develop is all groups of people throughout history began as hunter-gatherer societies. And so hunter-gatherer societies are societies where you basically hunt and gather all of your food. There are relatively few of these societies that are still left. Some Australian Aboriginals still adhere to hunter-gatherer methods of finding food. There are certain indigenous groups in Western Africa that are still hunter-gatherer societies, but most societies have transitioned from hunter-gatherer societies to, at the very least, agricultural societies. They have learned how to farm food, and in some cases farm animals as well, raise animals. And the difference between hunter-gatherer societies and agricultural societies are couple-fold. One of the things that changes as you move from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural society is hunter-gatherers exist under situations of food scarcity. They basically wander from place to place gathering food. And so each daily goal is to meet your caloric requirements for that day. And the next day you spend your time meeting your caloric requirements. And so in addition to food scarcity and as a consequence of food scarcity, hunter-gatherer societies are also mobile. When you move to an agricultural society, your food supply is now stationary. And because you're farming, you're spending your time growing food on a plot of land that you tend to have more food. That food also then keeps you stationary. So food scarcity is no longer an issue. You have a more abundant food supply, and you are now sedentary. You're settled in a place. This represents a pretty big transition, because if a society as a whole becomes agricultural, everybody in your society is sedentary. So now you find yourself interacting with people and on a pretty regular basis, and because food is abundant, your population growth rate increases, so you're now interacting with more and more people over time. As this occurs, you begin to not just have conflicts with other groups. So in hunter-gatherer societies, they would usually, typically hunter-gatherer societies have a set home range that they operate within. And when another group of hunter-gatherers encroaches upon that, you generally get conflict between groups. And so it isn't that hunter-gatherer societies are these idyllic sorts of societies. There is conflict, but typically the conflict involves conflict with other groups rather than conflict within the group, although that also happens. But when you start to get agricultural societies, as population size increases, as land becomes more valuable for food production, you begin to get conflicts within the group rather than just conflicts with other groups. This then negates or necessitates rather the need for governments. When you have conflict with people, you can either club them over the head with a stick, or you can take a more civilized approach to mediating disputes. And so governments begin to form. A lot of the purpose of this government formation is to essentially mediate these conflicts that are happening between people. As governments arise and as food becomes more abundant, not everybody has to be involved in the process of food production. And so now you have a society that can, because of food abundance, can lead to a division of labor. So now one part of your society is going to be raising food so that they can then sell to other people. And other people don't have to raise food, because if they have another skill that is valuable, they can basically make whatever money is, which oftentimes is governed by governments, and they can work at something other than food production and simply buy food from those people in society who produce it. In 1850, in the United States, roughly 80% of the American populace was involved in agriculture. In 2020, less than 2% of our, less than 2% of our population is involved in food production. So even in agrarian societies, that shifts as you become more and more technological. So this division of labor can do a number of things. Among the things that it does is it can help increase the abundance of food. So as you develop technologies in, for example, smelting iron and turning it into steel or bronze or whatever it is, you can now create plowshares more easily. Plows make it easier to cultivate land, so you can cultivate more acres of land, which then increases food supply, which increases population size, which increases the number of people that you have, and this thing just kind of cycles along. And so coming out of this abundance of food, you get this division of labor, and you get the rise of technology. And technology basically paves the way to all sorts of things happening. And so Jared Diamond traces technological advancement back to whether or not you were able to quickly and easily make this shift from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian society. Once you make that shift to an agrarian society, you develop towns and cities and city-states that require governments to run. You have an abundance of food, so population size goes up, you get a division of labor. As food production becomes crucial to your society surviving, land becomes more important. One of the things that governments do is governments form things like militaries to protect the land that is owned by the city-state that grows the food, et cetera. So you get the rise of technological societies growing out of agrarian societies. And there's a lot of other things that happen as you pack more and more people into close spaces. You get higher rates of transmission of disease. As a result of that, people die from diseases. Those individuals who have stronger immune systems are the ones who survive. So natural selection occurs even within human populations. And so the title of the book is Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he's basically talking about the rise of military power in these city-states because they need to protect the land that is used for food production, the increased prevalence of resistance to different pathogens because you have people crammed into limited amounts of space in high population centers due to this sedentary lifestyle that is brought on by agrarian habits. And then the steel part is just a general stand-in for the rise of technology while all of this is happening. And so he traces all of this back to this initial transition between hunter-gatherer societies and agrarian societies. So then the question is, well, why did we not have agrarian societies arising everywhere? And so what evidence does he provide? What does he talk about in the histories have and have nots section that kind of bolsters this idea that in some areas there was this natural endowment of plants and animals that enabled agriculture taking a hold, and in other areas there was not this natural endowment of plants and animals. This is the part where you guys talk. Just everybody unmute yourselves.
Can you ask the question again, please?
Yeah, so in this chapter, Jared Diamond is talking about geographic variation in the appearance of domesticable plants and animals, and he discusses whether or not that plants and animals that had a high probability of becoming domesticated, are those things randomly distributed around the globe, or are they localized? And what effect does this have on his general, broader sorts of conclusions?
He says that some places developed independently and then others with things were imported to them.
Okay, so you can have agriculture arising because you have a natural endowment where you were at, or you can have agriculture developing through trade with other groups of humans. And so this is, for example, how we see corn and squash and beans, which were originally found in Mesoamerica, southern Mexico and Central America. You also find those crops throughout North America. These were the kinds of crops that Native Americans were growing when the first Anglo people came to the United States. These are the crops that Native Americans were growing, and those crops made it into the Eastern Seaboard Native American groups, not because they were naturally occurring there, but they had been brought through trade among groups out of Central America into what later became the United States. So two ways in which you can get agriculture. Agriculture can be sitting in a spot waiting for you, or you can get those agricultural products from someplace else to start up agriculture in your area. Back in the time when agriculture was developing, though, which is about 10,000 years ago, what was global trade like?
By ship.
10,000 years ago, we didn't really have ocean-going ships.
Okay.
Yeah, those came much later, and actually in another book that Jared Diamond wrote called Collapse, he discusses one of the Chinese emperors who basically did not think that developing a seaworthy navy was a good use of the government's money. And during that crucial time period when they could have been developing naval power, China stepped back from naval power, and it happened to be at that same time that European powers were heavily investing in naval power. And at that particular juncture in history, European countries overtook China in terms of their kind of global domination. And so there's also this idea that Jared Diamond has of contingency. There are things that affect the course of global events that just happen. You know, there's no logical reason to expect something to happen. In this case, it was one particular Chinese emperor's odd aversion to ships and oceanic exploration that then set China behind the rest of the world in terms of their ability to expand their sphere of influence in the world. And it happened, you know, there at the end of the 1400s, beginning of the 1500s. And during that time period, Europe jumped ahead, and it's taken China ever since then to kind of catch up. And they've caught up now, evidently.
So 10,000 years ago, I can't remember. You're talking about world travel, right? Or world travel,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, global travel.
Was the bridge from Russia to Alaska melted by this point?
Yeah, that was all gone at this point. So what did you have in terms of human travel back during, you know, the period 8 to 10,000 years ago? You didn't have ocean-going ships. You didn't have planes. You didn't have trains. You didn't have automobiles. How are you getting from place to place?
Probably by walking it or by animals like horses and mules.
Yeah, you're either under human foot power or you're under the power of you know your domesticated animals that you have domesticated, assuming that you have domesticated animals. And so the movements of food from one culture to another culture back during this era of early agriculture are still relatively local. You see the Native Americans of the desert Southwest acquiring corn from Mexico, and then you slowly see the Midwestern Native Americans, some groups, starting to settle in areas because they have now imported corn from the desert Southwest Native Americans, and then corn slowly migrates east throughout the United States, what will later become the United States. But it's a very slow flow of the movement of crop species. What you don't see during that same period of time is you don't see corn cropping up in Europe, because no Europeans had made it to what then became known as the New World. None of the people from Europe had made it to the Americas, and as a result of that, that particular large movement of corn didn't happen until much later. Same thing with tomatoes. Same thing with certain varieties of beans, et cetera, et cetera. So while there is the possibility for the movement of crops over relatively small geographic spans, global trade isn't established until, once again, the 1500s. So from 10,000 years ago to the year 1500, which is, you know, about a little over 500 years ago, agriculture had to be started for the most part by what? Getting crops from other places, or using crops, potential crop species that occur where you're at.
Using crops where you were.
Yeah, so you're pretty much reliant on what's in the area where you live. And so when we look at, I'm going to go ahead a couple of things. When we look at this figure from Jared Diamond's book, what we see is that agriculture took hold in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, really, because the Andes has good agriculture and traditionally has had good agriculture. 6 well-established areas: the Fertile Crescent, China, the Eastern U.S., Mesoamerica, and the Andes. Amazonia has a question mark beside it because that's relatively recent stuff, and we're not super sure about all of that. So at least in 6 areas: Fertile Crescent, China, New Guinea, Eastern U.S., Mesoamerica, and the Andes. When we look at what plants and animals occur in all of these areas, what do we notice? And this figure here is largely skewed towards the animal issue, but we can also go back to this figure from earlier. This is a figure actually from your book, where it is basically a plant-centric version of the same map. What do you notice about these areas? Eastern North America, Mesoamerica, the Andes, the Fertile Crescent, China, and then of course New Guinea. Whether you're looking at the plant picture or the animal and plant picture, what do you notice about these different regions?
I feel like I'm way overthinking what this should be.
What do you think you're overthinking?
I'm not sure.
So if you're in the area of the Fertile Crescent, what do you have here? You've got sheep, you've got camels, you've got horses, you've got pigs, you've got cattle on the animal front. If you're in North America, you have turkeys. You have bison, but bison are not particularly domesticable, and we'll discuss reasons why. Certain animals are domesticable and other animals are not. In Mesoamerica, you have mainly plant crops, very few potential domesticable animals. In the Andes, you have basically one large caloric crop, which is potatoes, and the largest mammal that you have that is potentially domesticable are llamas and vicuñas. In China, you have chickens, pigs, and water buffalo, and you also have the development of rice. In the Fertile Crescent, you have lots of grain crops. You have wheat, you have barley, you have sorghum. All of those things are native to the Fertile Crescent. In Africa, you have relatively few grain crops that occur there naturally. The agrarian areas of the Sahel, which is just south of the Saharan Desert, is believed to have gotten their wheat from the Fertile Crescent. So that would represent, like Blake was talking about, one of these movements of a crop from one area to another area. But you see how those areas are relatively close to one another. And Africa is full of large mammals, but what's the problem with all those large mammals?
Can't domesticate them.
They're very difficult to domesticate, and we'll once again talk about why that is here in a little while. So Jared Diamond's argument is that if you had put any group of people in the Fertile Crescent 10 to 12,000 years ago, they would have come to dominate the world. What happened with humans is the first major city-states arose in the Fertile Crescent. Those people, as the rise in population size began to have environmental tolls, those people migrated out of the Fertile Crescent into Europe primarily, and those people in Europe came to basically in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, came to essentially dominate the world. And Jared Diamond's argument is that anybody that you put at that point geographically, at that point in time, would have gone down the same path because they had a very large natural endowment of large grained, grasses for the most part, and the large animals that were domesticable. Australian Aborigines didn't because they don't really have any large mammals at all. Africans had large mammals that were not domesticable. The Andes groups had one large mammal, but once again, it's not a very large mammal, and they really lacked a lot of the plant resources that you would need. Mesoamerica had a diversity of plant resources, but relatively few animal resources that were large. The largest mammal in Mesoamerica is a tapir, and it's a solitary organism. It's not an organism that does well in herds, and so it was never domesticated. So that's his argument, is that this area of the world was destined to become the world's dominators. The only challenge that these people had was the challenge from China. And even in China, they had rice, which is a great source of calories, but they had a reduced number of other types of grain crops, and they had a reduced number of domesticable animals. As a matter of fact, they had water buffalo, but when I was in Peru, right after I got out of graduate school, the Peruvian government had started this program by which they gave villages of Shipibo Indians, the Native Americans in the area where I was living in Peru. The Shipibo groups would get these water buffalo, and the intention of the government was that by having water buffalo, it would be a good source of meat and dairy products for the Indian groups in central Peru. But what the government didn't recognize is that water buffalo are amazingly big. They can actually be pretty aggressive if they're not really actively managed when they're younger to grow up to be tamer. And they put them in with a group of people who had no experience with large mammals like this. And so I was in one village one day, and the village's 2 water buffalo came into town, and everybody in town ran screaming into their huts because they were just fearful of the water buffalo. And as a result, these water buffalo were just kind of roaming around wild. Because they were wild, they were kind of aggressive, and the people didn't get any meat or any dairy out of them. So even the large mammal that they had available to them is a large mammal that can be domesticated, but you require some skills in order to domesticate it, because they can be dangerous, actually. So that's Jared Diamond's premise, is that certain parts of the world were predisposed because of the natural endowment of plants and animals that they had there to develop agrarian societies, to then develop city-states, develop technology, develop governmental structures, develop militaries, develop resistance to germs, resistance to disease, et cetera, that then set the stage for what would ultimately play out in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries of human history. So that's the evidence that he presents to support this. What flaws do you see in all of this? Once again, this is the part where you guys talk. Told you guys to take your conversation drug between Wednesday and now, and it looks like you didn't. Winston, Quinn, Branson, Jackson, Marcus, unmute yourselves. Thank you. Talk to me.
I mean, I feel like there's really no way to like have an argument if there's no way to like prove any of it.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
I mean, like he said, any group that like came from part of the world would be successful, but I feel like you can't necessarily say that not knowing, like it can't be proven, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a, the history of humans in the world is an unreplicated experiment. And of course, this is one of the problems with history. We know what happened, but it's difficult to predict what would have happened had something different been happening in the past. So yeah, this is a problem with all of the study of history. Um, I'm trying to recall from the beginning of the semester, is anybody in the Oxford program in here? No. Okay. Any of you history majors or poli-sci majors? No. Well, we don't have the benefit of history majors. So yeah, Winston, this is one of the difficulties with doing history, is you only have the one history that you have to go from. So that would be a flaw in any historical argument. Sure. What other things are you thinking about as you think about Diamond's idea? And by the way, one of Diamond's biggest group of critics has been historians.
Maybe the accuracy of the origins of the crops.
Okay, explain that to us a little bit, Blake.
Well, I feel like it's pretty hard to figure out the exact place where the crops first started being found.
Okay, and he discusses this some in the chapter, doesn't he? What are some of his own self-criticisms here and own sources of self-doubt about this?
1 second.
It starts on page 94, extends into 95 and 96, where he's talking about problems with ascertaining the origins of plant and animal species.
What's about the radiocarbon?
Yeah, so radiocarbon dating, it's a pretty good way of ascertaining the times of when things died, but there's errors associated with those measures, just like there's errors associated with any kind of measures. One of the errors is just due to the fact that the relative abundance of isotopes varies over time, and unless you have a time machine or have some way of sampling ancient atmospheres, it's very difficult to then calibrate those radiocarbon dates based on prior atmospheric conditions. Luckily for us, what have scientists been doing lately that has been giving us access to different isotopic signatures that are in the atmosphere? This has to do with climate change, actually. You guys don't follow the climate change literature, I'm guessing. So as the climate is warming, one of the big culprits of climate warming is carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels are going up because we're destroying forests, we're burning those forests, and we're also basically burning up a ton of fossil fuels every day. And so in order for those climate models to have any validity, one of the things that it would be nice to know is what is the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere in the deep past. And so one of the ways that you can do this is you can go to places like Antarctica and you can take cores of ice from glaciers in Antarctica. And the thing about the glaciers in Antarctica is that those glaciers were formed by the accumulation of ice and snow over really long periods of time, hundreds of thousands of years. In some cases, they have records from some of these glaciers that go back 600,000 years. And when you drill a core and you pull that core up, the interior parts of the core are filled with air pockets. And so you can basically sample the air in these air pockets from these very tall ice cores and look at what the atmospheric composition was 600,000 years ago. And so one of the nice things about people interested in climate is not only can they sample how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere back then, they can also sample what type of isotopic ratios were in the atmosphere of these different radioactive nucleotides. And so we have a better record of how that has changed in the atmosphere over the time period that we're talking about, 10 or 12,000 years, than we had a couple of decades ago, mainly because people have been sampling these ice cores for information about global carbon dioxide levels. So that's certainly a valid argument. My guess is that over time, we're going to be better and better about interpreting dates that are determined by radiocarbon dating, simply because, like all science, as you know more, you generally do a better and better job. What other difficulties are there about this idea?
The ratio of carbon-12 and carbon-14 fluctuates?
Yeah, sure. That's what I was just talking about. Yep. It fluctuates in the atmosphere. And if it fluctuates a lot, that throws your data off a lot, because you begin with wrong assumptions about what those ratios are. And so as carbon-14, as carbon-14 loses its neutrons, then converts into carbon-13. And as a result, if you start with a wrong estimate of what the ratio was, the ratio that you observe now is going to throw off your estimates of time, certainly.
The other problem that he states is that the archaeological sites are not always as sealed.
Are not always what?
As sealed as they could be, and so
yeah. So if radiocarbon dating has some difficulties, although it's still probably the best way of dating these things, one of the other problems is when you look at archaeological evidence. And so I've taught you about middens before. And so if you forget that term, let me write it on the board again. What are middens? M-I-D-D-E-N-S. You guys recall what middens are? I know I've talked about these. What's that?
Like a pile of trash.
Yeah, they're ancient trash heaps. And so as you dig down into ancient trash heaps, the further down in the trash heap you go, the further back you're going in time. And so the things that you're radiocarbon dating are oftentimes the substances that you find in these middens. Now, all a midden really tells you is that, in the case of pollen, or in the case of seeds, or in case of bones, all it really tells you is that those bones were at that site at that particular time in history. Because that's all it really tells you, what kinds of things is it not telling you? The midden tells you this bone was in this place at this time.
It's not telling you where it came from, maybe?
It's not telling you where it came from. It's not telling you this bone is in this midden at this time because this species was indigenous to this area. It could be that this bone is in this midden at this time because this group of people got that species from some other people somewhere else. Now, if you look at enough middens around the world, you can begin to do what?
Make predictions or like estimates on the general area of where they came from, maybe?
Yeah, so if you look in middens across a broad geographic region, you can say, okay, well, this bone shows up in all of these middens in all of these places. Then in that case, that would be good evidence that says, okay, well, this was a widely distributed species that a lot of people were using, especially if those bones appear in those middens all at the same time. But what do you know then if it's in some middens at earlier stages in history, but it doesn't appear in other middens until later?
They traveled.
Yeah, that would be evidence that would be in support of a particular crop species moving from one place to another as humans move from one place to another. So in all of this, there's a certain amount of detective work that goes on, and you're looking at the evidence that you see, and you're doing what scientists always do, which is you're making inferences about what's consistent with that pattern of evidence. So once again, it's an imprecise science, but the goal is to use the best evidence that you have to make the best inferences about whether or not crops were indigenous to an area or whether those crops were imported in from another area. But certainly, lots of scientific inferences have been incorrect over time. What you know of the biogeography of plant and animal crop species, does his argument seem reasonable? You can't see me shrugging my shoulders. Does it seem reasonable or does it seem far-fetched?
I'm hesitant to make a claim which in any direction because it's just so hard to say.
Because it's something that's in the deep past?
Yeah. And
Okay.
like I want to say that like because of the amount of variation in crops and animals in the Fertile Crescent, that yeah, it makes sense that you could put any people there and they would go on to develop those technologies quicker, and then they would expand first. It makes sense. However, there's a lot more that goes into it in the sense of like culture, religion, like what wars happened during that time. And
Yeah,
so
sure.
it's
So
just
it's
like
interesting. Go ahead. Continue.
if it was like a simulation, if the unpredictability of human nature wasn't in the situation, I'd say then yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah,
it
because sometimes you get people in power who are just batshit crazy. So actually in the book Collapse, he talks about the situation in China. China was ascendant, and there was just this one short period of time. I think that person's reign was about 50 years. And it basically took China kind of out of the global competition. And so, yeah, that there is this aspect of contingency that you always have to have in the back of your mind, certainly. Interesting what I was going to say earlier when I was trying to interrupt you and failed. The relationship between culture and religion. As culture develops, religion is something that often follows as a result, once again, of people getting together, collectively needing to understand nature, and then they create explanatory frameworks that ultimately evolve into religion. And so, yeah, that also is a part of it. Plenty of instances where religion has helped advance human development in terms of going from hunter-gatherer to agrarian to technologically advanced. And there are plenty of examples where religion has thwarted that progress as well. Other thoughts on this chapter? All right, we're about a day behind. And so I want to cover one last thing, and then we're going to stop for today. But this appears in chapter 9 of Diamond's book. And he has a whole chapter about domesticable animals. And he begins the chapter by talking about the first line of Anna Karenina. And Tolstoy's first line in that novel is that happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And then Diamond goes on to say domesticable animals are all alike. Every undomesticable animal is undomesticable in its own way. And so one of the things that I've talked about a couple of times now today is the domesticability, especially of large mammals. And so as he applies this idea to large mammals, in order to domesticate an animal, it has to have an entire suite of characteristics that make it amenable to domestication. It's better if it's an herbivore, because as animals consume other organisms, a lot of energy is lost. As the energy moves from one organism to another, only about 10% of that energy gets transferred. And so as a result, 90% of that energy just gets blown off to the atmosphere in the form of heat. So in order to really domesticate an animal, it's good if it's an herbivore, if it eats plants, because it's relatively low on the food chain. It doesn't require a ton of energy to sustain those organisms. It's better if the growth rate is fast, which most large mammals don't grow particularly fast. That's one of the characteristics of being large, is that you generally have relatively slow growth rates. So only those that have relatively fast growth rates. Can you breed it in captivity? If you go to a zoo, you see plenty of large mammals that are on the endangered species list in zoos. And quite frankly, one of the challenges of maintaining those populations is that many of those species prove to be very difficult to breed in captivity. So you have to be capable of breeding where people are hanging around, disrupting you and watching you. And many species don't do well under those environments. Pandas are notorious for this. Pandas breed fine out in the wild, but they don't breed very well in zoos. The disposition of the animal. Animals are not domesticable if they regularly kill you. Quick quiz. In zoos, what animal kills zookeepers most often? Mary.
Tigers.
No. Blair.
Elephants?
Elephants. Oh, we got to it much quicker than we normally get. Why do you say elephants?
They're just so large, and I assume most of it isn't on purpose.
Actually, elephants are very large and elephants are very aggressive.
Oh, never mind that.
I dated, when I was in graduate school, I dated a reproductive biologist who specialized in reproductive biology and artificial insemination in these large mammals that are hard to breed in captivity. And one of the groups that she worked on was rhinoceri, and she also worked on elephants. And so she was also trained as an elephant keeper at the zoo that she worked at. And when you start working with elephants, you basically put yourself in place of the dominant matriarch of a herd of elephants at a zoo, and you spend time every day maintaining that position in the hierarchy. And occasionally elephants will challenge you. And if you've ever been in an elephant house behind the scenes, which I have because I dated somebody who gave me access, what you'll oftentimes see is there are these big square buildings if you're looking down at it from the sky, and there are these big metal poles in the ground, and they're filled with cement. And they're all around the area where the elephants live, and then there's big gates so the elephants can go out to their exhibit. But there's this walkway that goes all the way around this, and this walkway is separated from the elephant area by these big, huge, thick, cement-filled steel poles that are embedded in the cement of the thing. And they're spaced such that a human can run full on through the gaps between them and flatten themselves against the wall and be out of reach of the longest trunk. And it's because it's a safety measure so you don't get killed by the elephant. And so they're designed in a very particular way because more zookeepers get killed by elephants than any other animal in the zoo. And if you lose your dominance in that environment, you're done. You're done at that zoo working with those animals because they now know that you are not the dominant elephant, and they will just basically do a variety of things. It actually has, there's actually a term for one of them. It's called headstanding. Elephant will wrap its trunk around your torso, turn you upside down, and basically just crush your head into the concrete. Another thing that they will do is they will knock you over, put their foot on your chest, and then put their other foot on your head. Now, you're a person in South Africa and you're looking for large mammals that you can domesticate. Elephant is not going to be on your list. They have very difficult dispositions. Tendency to panic. You want an animal that does not panic. And then there's this idea of social structure, which you want herding animals. And you want herding animals that have a social hierarchy and where herds occupy overlapping home ranges, because once again, that just reduces the conflict between the animals. One of the examples that Jared Diamond uses is horse herds. So horses are a herding animal. They have a social hierarchy. When herds of horses travel, usually it's the stallion at the back of the herd, the dominant mare is at the front of the herd, and then the mares in the herd take positions of lesser dominance as you get back further and further into the herd. And one of the things that makes horses easy to deal with in something like a pack line is that the cow person puts him or herself in the position of the dominant mare, and all of the other horses are lower down in the social hierarchy, and they will simply follow the dominant mare wherever the dominant mare is going. And so humans are able to take advantage of the natural tendency of organisms if they have certain characteristics. All domesticable animals that we have share these characteristics for the most part. If any one of these isn't in place, it makes it substantially more difficult to make that animal into a domesticated crop animal. And so one of the reasons that you see a lack of agriculture, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not because they lacked large mammals to potentially domesticate. It just so happens that all of the large mammals that live in South Africa happen to have one or more of these characteristics that just don't match up well with domestication. Rhinoceri tend to be solitary. They're not herd animals. Elephants are herd animals, but they're amazingly aggressive and hard to control in captive settings. Wildebeest are herd animals, but they actually turn out to be very, very flighty, along with a lot of the other antelope species that are around in South Africa. So all of those large mammals had things going against them in terms of converting them into domesticated animals. And Diamond would argue, as a result, there's no large mammal from South Africa that has ever been domesticated except for the buffalo. And once again, that is a relatively limited domestication. Same thing with tapirs. Tapirs are solitary, and as a result, they don't do well in large groups when you do try and domesticate them. Llamas in South America in the Andes are herd animal. They do relatively well in herds, but they're not particularly large in terms of all of the domesticated animals that we have on the face of the earth. They'll be a couple of 100 pounds, 400 pounds, as opposed to an adult steer, which will be upwards of 1,200 to 1,600 pounds. And so total amount of meat on the hoof is not very high for llamas. And then in the Andes, you didn't have that many other good sources of calories beyond potatoes. So Mesoamerica, for the most part, lacked large mammals, even though they had a good vegetable crop. In the U.S., there were, in what later became the United States, the Midwestern Indians relied heavily on bison. But once again, if you go on YouTube and view any of the hundreds of videos of bison attacking human beings, when human beings get too close, you'll also see that bison were not a terribly easy animal to domesticate as well.
Is that why it became more nomadic?
Yeah, so in the case of Native Americans in the Midwest, those tribes were nomadic mainly because they were following bison herds. When they did begin to settle down, they would settle down for certain times of the year, and they would actually burn off the grasses to promote new grass growth in order to attract bison herds to their settlement rather than having to chase them around. So over time, even the way Native Americans dealt with a wild animal, they dealt with it in a way that they used their own control of kind of primitive technology in order to manipulate the wild animals that they were hunting. Questions about all of this? All right, I have your exams graded. I will be sending them out to you via email shortly. The scores, the average scores ended up being, I actually went back and looked at this because I was getting depressed while grading them. The average scores were not that different from the scores from last year. And so I assume they're probably not that different from the scores on the first exam in previous years, but they weren't great. And so I want you to take a look at your test over the weekend, and I want to begin Monday talking about the exam, because I need to know what I need to be doing differently to get you to learn the material in better ways. And I need ideas about what you might be thinking about doing differently as we approach the next exam, because it would be nice to see exam scores going up. I'm just going to be honest with you. Your exam score, and this is going to sound terrible, but let me explain it before you react to it. I don't really care what your exam score is. I think exams are a necessary evil that we employ in education in order to assess learning. My concern is that your exam score is a reflection of what you're learning or not learning. And I want you to learn the material that we're going through, and the exam scores indicate to me that you're not learning it. So it's either because I'm not doing something correctly, or you're not doing something correctly, or we're both not doing something correctly. And what I want us to do is work on at the beginning of the class on Monday is figuring out what we all collectively can do better as we go through this material. I realize this is a new learning environment and things like this. We have a room reserved for us that is set up for appropriate social spacing and things like this. If you really think that you would learn better in-person classes, I'm willing to entertain the idea of shifting to that. That's how I originally kind of wanted things to be if we had been better humans and gotten COVID under control. So think over the weekend. Olivia, that's a thumbs up. You would be in favor of in-person class?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So think seriously about it. Look at the exam. I'll post a key also on Moodle so that you can see what the answer should have been. And think about things that I'm doing that could be different, better, et cetera, at helping you learn things. And think about things that you might change with your own study habits and things like that that might affect outcomes somewhat. And we'll have a discussion of that on Monday. I've tried to do what I could in terms of giving you review sheets and a copy of an old exam and things like that in an effort to help you, but at least for some of you that clearly wasn't adequate. So anyway, take a look at those, think about it over the weekend, and come on Monday with some ideas. The other thing I want you to do for Monday is come prepared to discuss chapter 1 and 2 of Michael Pollan's book. The first chapter we've already talked about some, but we haven't talked about it in a great deal of detail. Chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1 will help us wrap up and tie up a bunch of the things that we've already been talking about. And chapter 2 will give us a starting point for the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is nutrient cycling. because that's the chapter in Michael Pollan's book where he starts to talk about nutrient cycling and how that relates to corn. So if you haven't read those 2 chapters yet, read them over the weekend and come ready to chat about those then. All right, questions? All right, then. I'll see you guys on Monday.